All right, let's get right into this explainer. If you ever find yourself driving down the South Dixie Highway in Homestead, Florida, which is just a little ways outside of Miami, you are going to stumble upon a structure that, quite frankly, just defies initial comprehension. It's called the Coral Castle, and it's this world-famous attraction that has completely fascinated visitors, engineers, and scholars for practically a century at this point. I mean, even the rock musician Billy Idol was so captivated by the place that he wrote his hit song Sweet 16 all about it. Today, it's proudly sitting on the National Register of Historic Places. But what exactly is it? And why in the world is it considered one of the most enigmatic achievements in modern history? Let's find out.
So, here's the question that's been baffling people since the attraction first opened its doors. If you look at the informational sheets right there at the site, they proudly boast that you are about to see an engineering marvel routinely compared to Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids of Egypt. But there's a huge catch. Unlike those ancient wonders, which, as we know, were constructed by literal armies of thousands of laborers over multiple generations, Coral Castle has a drastically different origin story. The entire site, every single massive stone, every towering wall, was built by one single human being, working entirely alone.
To truly wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this accomplishment, consider this staggering number: 1,000. The Coral Castle is composed of over 1,000 tons of quarried oolite limestone. And a quick side note, despite the name Coral Castle, it's not actually made of coral, but rather this highly textured sedimentary rock. Just imagine quarrying, lifting, moving and carving 2 million pounds of solid stone. That is a staggering amount of material for a modern construction crew armed with heavy machinery, let alone a single guy working out under the brutal Florida sun with absolutely zero modern technological assistance. And you want to know what makes that feat even more impossible? The number 100, because that was the total weight in pounds of the architect and sole builder Edward Leedskalnin. Edward was a Latvian immigrant who stood just 5 feet tall. I mean, think about that physical contrast for a second. A man weighing barely 100 pounds maneuvering over 1,000 tons of solid rock. It's this jarring discrepancy, the colossal, unyielding weight of the creation versus the slight, unassuming frame of its creator that really birthed the legend we're looking at today. Now, he didn't just stack a bunch of boring square blocks. The sheer variety of what Edward managed to carve out of this rock is absolutely mind-boggling. He sculpted enormous slab walls to enclose the whole property. He carved intricate stone tables and chairs for visitors to actually sit at. He erected this giant, towering crescent moon. He even somehow engineered a functioning water fountain straight out of the limestone and a perfectly precision-tuned stone sundial. It's essentially an entire village of colossal objects painstakingly crafted to create this bizarre, surreal park out of solid stone. Okay, but the absolute crown jewel of this whole mystery, the infamous 9-ton gate. For decades, this was the ultimate party trick of Coral Castle. It was a massive 9-ton block of stone functioning as a swinging gate, and it was balanced so perfectly that, despite its massive weight, it would easily swing open with a strong breeze, or you could literally just push it with a single finger. People were completely mystified. How could a 100-pound man perfectly balance a 9-ton stone? Well, the mystery held up until 1986, when the gate finally stopped moving. Engineers came in to remove and fix it, and they discovered his secret. Edward had drilled a hole straight through the rock and rested it on a hidden metal shaft and a salvaged truck bearing. Just pure, brilliant mechanical ingenuity. So, who is this guy really? And why dedicate his entire life to this grueling labor? Well, Edward Leedskalnin was a poor immigrant with only a 4th-grade education. But he had a powerful, incredibly heartbreaking motivation. The legend goes that back in Latvia, he was engaged to a 16-year-old sweetheart, but on what was supposed to be their actual wedding day, she abandoned him. Spurned by his lost love, Edward packed up, eventually moving to Florida, and he was driven by a singular, burning desire to prove to her, and really to the entire world, that he could make something of himself and do something truly remarkable, despite his poverty and lack of formal education. Now, as you might imagine, spending decades entirely alone carving giant rocks gives a person plenty of time to think. Edward wasn't just a builder. He considered himself a philosopher, and quite an eccentric one at that. He actually self-published this moralizing pamphlet outlining his personal views, which he very optimistically titled A Book in Every Home. In it, he expressed some highly unusual opinions. For instance, he complained that schools and churches were cheapening the girls by arranging picnics and coupling them up with fresh boys so they could practice, and this is a direct quote, first-degree lovemaking.
He was a deeply private, complex man with some very rigid, quirky perspectives on society.
And his eccentric philosophy definitely bled into his politics and his personal work ethic, too. Edward possessed an unbelievably strict personal conviction when it came to self-sufficiency. He even wrote that unemployed individuals, whom he rather bluntly referred to as weaklings, should actually be stripped of their voting rights. His logic was basically that anyone too weak to make their own living simply wasn't strong enough to vote, and would therefore only weaken the state. We are, of course, just exploring his views here, not endorsing them, but you can clearly see how this intense, unrelenting mindset fueled his ability to literally move mountains of stone by the sweat of his own brow.
Let's trace the actual timeline of his obsession, because it's wild. Back in 1923, he officially opened his creation to tourists, originally calling it Rockgate Park, and he'd often be there to personally greet visitors. But he didn't stop there. A few years later, he caught wind that a new housing subdivision was being planned near his property. So what did he do? He bought land 10 miles away in Homestead, and then spent 3 entirely solitary years moving the massive stone structures he had already built to the new location. He worked completely alone for a total of 28 years until his death in 1951, leaving behind this completed, awe-inspiring masterpiece.
All right, so the million-dollar question. How on earth did he actually do it? Well, over the decades, some really wild, almost comical theories emerged. People genuinely claimed he used psychic levitation, or that he magically sang to the stones to make them float. Others swore up and down he had arcane knowledge of magnetism, or was somehow harnessing hidden earth energies. But, as tempting as it is to view this through a veil of supernatural mystery, the engineering reality is infinitely more rewarding. Edward Leedskalnin did this using the strict, grounded principles of leverage. He used basic hand tools like picks, winches, and ropes. In fact, old photographs actually show him using large wooden tripods and block-and-tackle pulleys. Plus, that massive oolite limestone, because it's porous, it's actually significantly lighter than it looks.
The reality of how he built it is what actually forms the core of his legacy. See, Edward wasn't a total hermit. He did have friends. One of them was a building contractor named Orville Irwin, a guy who deeply understood construction. In 1996, Irwin wrote a book called Mr. Kant is Dead, where he utilized photos and schematics to prove exactly how Edward built the castle. Irwin absolutely hated the alien and magic theories. He found them completely insulting to his friend's integrity. As Irwin beautifully put it, his was a generation who knew accomplishments by the sweat of the brow. It wasn't mysticism, but hard work. Edward didn't have magic, folks. He had undeniable, relentless human determination.
Ultimately, the story of Coral Castle isn't a story of the paranormal. It is a profound testament to the absolute limits of human willpower and basic physics. Edward Leedskalnin took his grief, his poverty, and his 100-pound frame, and he applied simple tools and relentless leverage to carve out a permanent place for himself in history. Which leaves us all with a rather inspiring question to end on. If one man can move over 1,000 tons of stone entirely by himself, what monumental project could you accomplish with nothing but time, leverage, and a broken heart? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you on the next one.